The town of Aberdeen, located in New South Wales, Australia, has always remained a quiet and peaceful place where everyone knew each other. It was a small mining town where most of the inhabitants worked in coal and iron mines. The daily lives of local people were centered around work, families, and meetings in small pubs after long shifts where they could discuss the news and share personal stories. High-profile incidents rarely happened here, and residents appreciated their tranquility and well-established traditions, and therefore when John Price and Catherine Knight began their relationship, no one predicted anything unusual in their story. People perceived their couple as another one of those that arise in small towns, where everyone strives to find a companion to share the difficulties of everyday life. John Price, who works as a miner, was one of the respected members of the society. Good-natured and responsive, he was able to find a common language with others and was always ready to help in difficult times. Over the years of working at the mine, he earned a reputation as an honest and reliable person who could be relied upon. His neighbors and friends knew him as a cheerful, optimistic, and hard-working man who, despite a difficult job, maintained good spirits and sincere goodwill. Conflicts rarely arose in his social circle, as John always sought to avoid trouble and smooth out sharp corners. Catherine Knight was well known in Aberdeen, but on a completely different side. Her story was not easy, and her reputation was ambiguous. Born into a family with numerous problems, Catherine went through a difficult childhood filled with traumatic events. These early experiences left their mark on her character, forming a personality with a heavy and short temper. From an early age, she showed a tendency to aggression, and those around her knew that Catherine was easily angered. Her outbursts of anger were abrupt and not always explicable, and her tendency to conflict became more and more noticeable with age. Catherine often changed jobs, got into conflicts with colleagues and superiors, and rarely found long-term friends. When Catherine and John started dating, their couple surprised many people they knew. Nevertheless, no one wanted to condemn their choice. Perhaps, they thought, the calm and good-natured John would be able to soften Catherine's harsh character. At first, their relationship seemed quite peaceful, and John seemed to be the kind of person who managed to find an approach to her. He listened to her patiently, supported her, and it seemed that Catherine, having found stability next to him, was able to become more restrained. In their small house in Aberdeen, ordinary life was in full swing, and to the outsider's eye, they were as ordinary a couple as everyone around them. However, as the relationship deepened, Catherine became more and more unpredictable. Her bouts of jealousy and outbursts of anger began to manifest themselves more often and more strongly. Every time John stayed late at work or socialized with friends, Catherine expressed dissatisfaction and accused him of infidelity and insincerity. She increasingly staged scenes that began with a showdown and ended with screams and threats. John's friends and colleagues noticed that he began to change. A good-natured and calm man became more withdrawn, went out less often, and tried to avoid talking about his personal life. John's friends were worried about him and offered to help, but he didn't want to draw attention to his problems. Like many people in similar situations, John hoped that conflicts would subside over time and that Catherine's short temper could be mitigated with love and patience. He believed that difficulties were only temporary moments that happen in any relationship, and he was not going to back down. Some friends, seeing his tenacity, even began to believe that John could really change Catherine, although they saw that he increasingly avoided talking about her. When one of the friends tried to discuss the situation, he walked away from the topic or turned the conversation to something else, which caused others even more concern. Against the background of these changes, tensions between John and Catherine grew, and John's attempts to resolve conflicts only aggravated the situation. He tried to explain his actions to her to prove that she should not doubt his honesty and tried to smooth out the thorny moments. But the more he tried to calm her down, the stronger her bouts of aggression and jealousy became. Catherine, feeling that her accusations were met only with patience and gentleness, interpreted this as weakness and began to behave even more persistently. Over time, John's friends began to notice more and more alarming signs that could not be ignored. Quarrels and conflicts became a familiar part of their relationship, and each new dispute led to more serious consequences. However, John still did not allow interference in his personal life and avoided talking about what was happening at his home. He continued to hope that their problems would be solved and that Catherine would change over time. But in the end, it turned out that patience and faith in the best would not be able to stop the impending tragedy. On March 1st, 2000, John Price's house in the small mining town of Aberdeen, Australia, was at the center of one of the most terrifying cases in the history of criminology. When John did not show up at work and did not get in touch, his colleagues began to worry. Usually punctual and responsible, he had never disappeared without warning before, and knowing his character, his friends immediately felt that something was wrong. After several attempts to reach him without receiving a response, they contacted the police. The Aberdeen police responded quickly to the call, realizing that in such a small town, even small deviations in behavior can be a sign of trouble. 2 police officers arrived at Price's house with a check, intending to find out what could have happened. The house was quiet and looked ordinary for a small town, a small well-kept garden, modest furniture. But something about this place was alarming, and the police began to approach the door, sensing that something terrible was hiding behind it. Upon entering the house, they immediately noticed an unusually tense atmosphere. Everything looked quiet and silent, but tension seemed to be in the air. The house was lifeless, but at the same time it felt as if it was hiding dark secrets within its walls. The police moved inside, carefully examining everything around, and soon they felt an unpleasant smell that came from the depths of the house. It was a strange, indeterminate smell that could not be confused with anything, and it caused great anxiety. Walking along the corridor, they noticed an unusual arrangement of objects in the kitchen, which immediately seemed suspicious to them. The table was set, but not with the usual household utensils, but with something that made them stop. There was a pot on the stove in which something was cooking, and as they got closer, the police saw that this was far from an ordinary dish. The strange scene that opened up in front of them in the kitchen left no doubt that something terrible had happened in the house. Cutlery was laid out on the table, and at first glance it seemed that everything had been prepared for an ordinary dinner. But the longer they looked, the more they realized that this scene was strange, frightening, and completely abnormal. The details they saw suggested that someone was meticulously preparing some kind of ritual, as if he wanted not just to cause harm, but to send a frightening message. All the objects were arranged in an unusual way, and with each step, the police became convinced that something beyond their experience had taken place here. The police began to search the rest of the rooms, hoping that they could find John and perhaps answer the questions that were growing in their minds. The more they explored the house, the clearer it became that John was no longer there in the usual sense. There were grim signs in every room that a brutal and uncompromising attack had unfolded here. They discovered that someone had committed not only physical but also moral violence against Price, leaving behind traces of a destructive impact. The details of the crime indicated a conscious action and a deep malice that lay at the heart of this terrible act. What was especially terrifying for the police was that the crime scene looked not only like a place of violence, but also like a kind of set design. Everything in the house was laid out as if the perpetrator wanted to create a certain image or atmosphere, as if it were an elaborate performance. Every detail, every object looked thought out to the smallest detail, and this inspired even more horror than the fact of the crime itself. The police felt that their role was not only to collect evidence, but also to try to understand what the perpetrator meant by this scene. During the inspection, they drew attention to the bedroom, where they found several of John's personal belongings, among which were photographs of family and friends, small household items, and this only increased the contrast with what they saw in the kitchen. Everything said that this house was an ordinary, peaceful place, designed for life and recreation, and that made the scene in the kitchen seem even more unnatural. The police understood that they were faced with a crime where the motives could be much deeper and darker than they could have imagined. Meanwhile, they continued to inspect, discovering more and more strange details indicating the premeditation and planning of the criminal's actions. During the search and examination of the crime scene, the police drew attention to Catherine Knight's personal belongings, which indicated her presence in the house. They began to speculate that she might have been directly involved in this terrible act. She was found unconscious and taken to the hospital, where she later stated that she did not remember anything about the incident. When the criminologists arrived at the scene to collect evidence and conduct an analysis, they confirmed that the crime was committed with extreme cruelty and was accompanied by attempts to create a frightening image. Experts drew attention to the fact that the perpetrator not only attacked the victim, but also tried to demonstrate his actions as an act of intimidation or an attempt to attract attention. This crime was a complex combination of physical violence and psychological pressure. These observations allowed the investigation to suggest that Catherine Knight may have been driven by deep and ulterior motives, perhaps jealousy or hatred, which reached their peak at the time of the crime. Everything pointed to the fact that Catherine probably prepared for this in advance, since her actions were distinguished by the accuracy and consistency peculiar only to a person who thinks through every step. Investigators began to realize that this murder was not impulsive or spontaneous. The preparation they saw at the crime scene and the details arranged with great care showed that the actions were deliberate and carefully planned. When information about the crime scene became known in the city, the residents of Aberdeen were shocked. In a small community where everyone knew each other, no one could believe that something like this had happened next to them. John Price was known as a good-natured man who never clashed with others, and the fact that he was the victim of such a brutal crime shocked everyone. Catherine Knight, who seemed strange but not dangerous, suddenly found herself in the spotlight, and her reputation changed dramatically. No one who knew her could believe that she was capable of such an act, and as information about the details of the crime spread, the confusion in society grew. Investigators and criminologists working at the crime scene understood that this case would require a thorough analysis, not only of the physical evidence, but also of Catherine's psychological state. They began to collect her story, study her behavior in her relationship with John, as well as her previous incidents of aggression and outbursts of jealousy. The investigation soon concluded that Catherine had been showing signs of instability for a long time, and her relationship with Price was far from normal. The evidence found in John Price's house helped the investigation to draw key conclusions about who and how could have committed this crime. The attention of the police was immediately directed to Catherine Knight, who was in the house at the time of the arrival of the police, although she claimed that she did not remember the details of what happened. Despite this, investigators began to increasingly suspect that Catherine played a central role in the events that unfolded at Price's home. One of the most important factors that helped to identify Catherine as the main suspect was her personal belongings found in John's house. Catherine lived separately, and her presence in the house was inexplicable, especially after a series of conflicts with Price, which were known to his friends and colleagues. After their breakup, John's friends repeatedly heard from him that Catherine threatened him and showed outbursts of anger, especially when he tried to distance himself from her. The police understood that her presence in his house on the day of the tragedy was extremely suspicious. At the first interview, Catherine was found in a state of severe nervous shock, which seemed normal for a person who had experienced shock. She claimed that she did not remember anything and could not explain why she was at John's house that night. However, her behavior caused conflicting feelings among the investigators. She showed signs of calmness and confidence, which were suddenly replaced by panic. Investigators noted that her reaction did not correspond to the typical behavior of a shock victim and rather resembled the behavior of a person who was trying to hide his involvement. The police knew that they had several important clues at their disposal, but the key ones were the testimonies of John's friends and acquaintances, who confirmed that the relationship between Catherine and John was far from peaceful. Price's colleagues said that on the eve of the tragedy, he shared his fears and talked about his fear of Catherine, claiming that she often became aggressive. These testimonies gave the police reason to assume that Catherine may have felt deep jealousy and resentment, which prompted her to attack. In addition, objects were found in the house that indicated Catherine's presence on different days before the incident. According to investigators, they found personal items that could not belong to John, which indicated that she had been to his house repeatedly, perhaps even without his knowledge. This indicated her obsessive behavior and led the police to believe that Catherine could have carefully planned her actions in advance. Forensic scientists who analyzed the traces and evidence found that DNA traces belonging to Catherine were found on some things and in different parts of the house. These data became strong evidence of her presence at the crime scene and confirmed that she was with John in the last hours of his life. Forensic experts have indicated that her fingerprints and biological traces at the crime scene indicate direct involvement in the events of that night and not an accidental presence. During further interviews, when investigators began to present Catherine with the evidence they found, her version of what happened began to change. She denied any involvement and claimed that she did not remember how she ended up in the house. However, when she was shown the results of DNA analysis, fingerprints, and witness statements, she began to give confused explanations. At one point, she admitted that she had come to John, but claimed that she could not have harmed him. Then her stories became more emotional. She tried to imagine the situation as if she had been in the house by accident and did not remember what had happened in the last few hours. Psychologists invited to work with Catherine and evaluate her behavior also contributed to the investigation. They noted that her emotional state and behavior largely indicate pathological jealousy and problems with self-control. Catherine was prone to outbursts of rage, especially at times when she felt threatened or out of control of the situation. This explained her obsessive desire to keep John around and her inability to accept his decision to end the relationship. Psychologists concluded that she could have serious problems with the perception of rejection, which made her potentially dangerous to those who tried to distance themselves from her. Catherine Knight, trying to evade responsibility, repeatedly changed her testimony, but investigators continued to present new evidence of her guilt. Each time her stories became less convincing. Eventually, when the investigation had gathered enough evidence, the police were ready to file formal charges against her. When investigators finally gathered all the evidence, confirming Catherine Knight's involvement in the murder of John Price, they prepared for her official arrest. The police understood that the case had gained considerable resonance, and everyone was watching its development. Catherine, who, by that time, could no longer deny the evidence gathered against her, found herself in the public spotlight. Her behavior, versions of events, and emotional reactions became the subject of discussion as the details of the case became known to a wide audience. Catherine Knight was arrested and taken to a police station, where she was to face charges of premeditated murder. Her arrest was an important milestone in the case. The police and the prosecutor's office understood that they were conducting a case that would require careful preparation in order to present an impenetrable evidence base in court. Given the gruesome nature of the crime and the evidence gathered, the investigation hoped to achieve the most severe punishment for Catherine. At first, Catherine tried to appear calm, but her behavior during interrogations continued to raise questions from investigators. At one of the first interrogations, she rejected the previous version of the memory lapse and stated that her relationship with John was complicated and full of conflicts. She tried to imagine herself as a victim of their difficult relationship, pointing out that their conflicts sometimes escalated into quarrels. However, her story did not convince the investigators, as all the testimonies and stories of John's friends and colleagues spoke of his peaceful nature and lack of aggression. This, on the contrary, emphasized that all the threats came from Catherine. Catherine's behavior during interrogations further convinced investigators that she was trying to create a false impression. She showed a strange combination of emotional instability and, as it seemed to them, false confidence, which aroused suspicion of her attempts to manipulate the investigation. When the investigators asked her directly about the events on the night of the murder, she began to confusingly tell them that she had come to John to make peace, but allegedly did not remember what happened next. However, the results of the examination showed that her arrival could not have been accidental. Numerous evidence collected at Price's house indicated deliberate actions and cold-blooded behavior. At some point, Catherine tried to turn the conversation to another topic, starting to claim that the reason for her actions were psychological problems, and she, in her words, lost control. But the investigators, knowing her penchant for manipulation, saw this as just another attempt to evade responsibility. She played on pity, trying to elicit sympathy from the investigators, but even the psychologists who observed her noted that her behavior was too predictable and artificial. All this only reinforced the police's suspicions that Catherine had originally planned the crime and was well aware of what she was doing. Taking into account the collected evidence, the investigators began to form an accusation based on premeditated murder, with elements of brutal violence. The evidence gathered from biological traces to witness statements clearly indicated that her motives were related to jealousy and a thirst for control. The process of Catherine's arrest and further interrogations was under intense public scrutiny. The public was shocked by the revealed details, and each new fact that became known further increased their dislike for her. People could not believe that a crime committed with such cruelty and thoroughness could be the work of a woman who at first glance did not differ in anything special. The media covered the investigation in detail, and the public waited tensely for exactly what charges would be brought against her. When the dossier was finalized and the prosecution presented all the available evidence, a decision was made to send the case to trial. The trial of Catherine Knight has become one of the most high-profile and controversial cases in Australia. By the time the trial began, public attention to the case had reached its peak, and journalists, media representatives, and even some residents of Aberdeen gathered in the courtroom to find out the details of the case. Since everyone was waiting for a fair punishment for the accused, the trial took place under close attention and caused lively discussions in the press and society. The prosecution, based on the evidence gathered and the testimony of witnesses, immediately took a hard line, insisting that the murder of John Price was a planned act of violence and cruelty. Prosecutors described in detail the evidence gathered at John's house, pointing out that Catherine did not act in a state of passion, but quite consciously. They stressed that the objects found at the crime scene, biological traces, fingerprints, as well as Catherine's contradictory testimony indicated that she intended to commit this crime in advance and tried to destroy evidence. At the trial, the prosecution also cited testimony from John's family and colleagues, who confirmed that Price felt in danger and repeatedly talked about his fear of Catherine. The prosecutor focused on the testimony that spoke about the growing tension in their relationship, adding that John actually tried to break this connection, but Catherine constantly returned to him and showed signs of aggression and jealousy. The prosecution emphasized that it was these emotions that prompted Catherine to take control of the situation in a violent way when she realized that John wanted to end their relationship forever. Catherine's defense tried to present her as a victim of difficult circumstances, claiming that her actions were caused by severe psychological stress and an unstable emotional state. The defense insisted that Catherine allegedly did not remember the events of that night and committed the crime while in a state of temporary mental disorder. They put forward a theory that her behavior and motives are related to personal psychological problems accumulated over many years, and that she should have been sent for compulsory treatment rather than a strict prison term. To support their version, the defense invited several psychologists who explained that Catherine really suffered from emotional instability and had a difficult childhood, which influenced her behavior. Experts noted that she showed symptoms of borderline personality disorder, which could increase her jealousy, tendency to control, and inability to come to terms with the breakup. They claimed that at the time of the crime, Catherine lost control of her actions, acting in an affective state, and did not fully realize the consequences of her actions. However, the prosecution presented experts who challenged the conclusions of the defense psychologists. These experts argued that although Catherine may have had personal and psychological problems, her actions were planned and deliberate. Experts from the prosecution pointed to Catherine's careful preparation and cold-blooded behavior before and after the crime, which were too logical and consistent for a person in a state of passion. In their opinion, Catherine clearly understood what she was doing, and her actions demonstrated a desire not only to attack, but also to intimidate. Catherine's very performance in court also played a role in shaping the jury's opinion. Her testimony was inconsistent. She changed versions of events and tried to present herself as a person who suffered from emotional pressure. However, Catherine's behavior, her strange outbursts of emotion and attempts to manipulate the court, had rather a negative effect on the jury. They saw before them a woman whose attempts to evade responsibility looked less convincing as the details of the case were revealed. In the end, the jury returned a verdict. Catherine Knight was found guilty of the premeditated murder of John Price. The judge made an unprecedented decision for Australia. Catherine was sentenced to life in prison without the right to parole. This sentence emphasized the particular cruelty and coldness of the crime and became the first case in the history of the country when a woman was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to pardon. The verdict of Catherine Knight caused a wide response in Australia. The case shocked the public and became a starting point for discussions of mental health and domestic violence. Experts in the media emphasized the importance of early identification of problems in relationships and emotional support in order to prevent such tragedies. Catherine's image has become entrenched as a symbol of extreme cruelty, and her sentence has become a landmark decision for the Australian legal system, underlining her willingness to apply the strictest measures in response to such crimes.